Okay, I think that is recording. So I'm back. It's autumn in Melbourne, but it feels like the middle of winter. And I've just come home and I was feeling freezing, but I've spent the last week on public transport to and from work reading Dr. King. And I know I said that I would do Hannah Arendt next, The Origins of Totalitarianism. And I did start to read Hannah, but she is very dense, and German philosophy is very intense. So I picked up Martin Luther King, and I didn't expect it to be so profound on rereading at this moment. I've left the book at work, but the book I was reading was called The Radical King, which was a compilation of essays and transcripts of sermons that King has given, compiled by Dr. West. And it was really moving to read King, because I have in some corner of my mind kind of categorized him as the master of non-violence, and in times of such tumult and tension kind of relegated him to an iconic status rather than thinking about his direct relevance. And it has been enlightening to really read him again, to just be inspired by what he laid forth as his method for social change under times that couldn't have been more arduous. So I kind of have compiled a couple of quotes about Dr. King's philosophy that have been, sanitized to some extent, or what Dr. West would describe as Santa Clausified, which means that for Dr. West, the more radical elements of Dr. King's philosophy have been siphoned out of it. And when he's talking about those radical elements, he's really talking about his stance against war and against poverty. The one that he is most renowned for is anti-racism, but he was an anti-militarist. He was anti-poverty, and he was anti-war. So I think to really understand who King was, I think you have to begin with the acknowledgement that his philosophy came out of what he described as revolutionary Christianity. So he was a revolutionary Christian, and he really saw his calling to be the embodiment of a Christ-like consciousness, dictated by the imperative that you needed to love your enemy. And if we think about really the gargantuan nature of this task in contemporary terrain, it almost becomes something ethereal or saint-like. But the practice of it, the way Dr. King practiced it, was that he struggled with it on a day-to-day basis. So he really did attempt to love his oppressor, because he felt that it was the righteous thing to do, and that in loving his oppressor he would release morally not just himself and the people he was fighting for, but his oppressor. And this is kind of an extraordinary feat if we think about it now, the possibility of loving your enemy. So I thought there was some particularly poignant things that stood out. So having done Gandhi before, and having been startled by the nature of Gandhi's definition of non-violence, which was that you had to have the courage to be violently aggressed. It was interesting to read what Dr. King had to say about Gandhi. And he was very much in awe of him. So he says His definition of non-violence is very much aligned with Gandhi's definition. So he says, while the non-violent resistor is passive in the sense that he is not physically aggressive towards his opponent, his mind and emotions are always active, constantly seeking to persuade his opponent that he is wrong. The method is passive physically, but strongly active spiritually. It's not passive non-resistance to evil, it's active non-resistance to evil. So he felt that there was some process of transmutation that happened, not just to himself but to his aggressor when he expressed non-violence as his method of resistance. And he said that ultimately this was the righteous way of transformation because his understanding that the aftermath of violence is always bitterness. And what you needed to create was not just the emancipation of your community, but to reimagine the whole community into a plane where there was everybody was afforded the opportunity to be a morally righteous incarnation of God. So really, that type of courage comes from spiritual conviction. If we look at Gandhi and King, to try and imagine that they would find the courage not just to have violence done upon them, but to love their enemy and think that they could transform their enemy through their own morally correct behaviour is really a spiritual conviction. And he said that the process that needed to be undertaken by the individual who was engaged in this activity was to forgive. And he describes this particular, in one chapter in the book, he describes himself returning from a march where people have been beaten and arrested and treated appallingly, that he starts to lose his capacity for compassion for the people that have done that. But he then goes through a process where he tries to imagine the circumstances that have come around that have, created that sort of behavioural response in a particular segment of the white community. So he goes through all of these imaginings of the fact that they were being raised in a culture of supremacy, that they feel disempowered, by the opportunities that life has given them, that they need a Negro to aggress in order to feel, empowered in their own lives. And he says that in the absence of forgiving these people for that trespass, it's not going to be possible to create a society that everybody can be emancipated in. So he says on forgiveness means reconciliation, a coming together again. Without this, no man can love his enemies. The degree to which we are able to forgive determines the degree to which we are able to love our enemies. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. And I know that quotation kind of does the rounds on Facebook, as a meme or something. But when you really consider the seriousness of that proposition, so to love your enemy, and the extraordinary conditions under which King attempts to love his enemy, is just really boggles the mind and really shames many of the faux tensions that are dividing the political landscape at the moment. But in terms of his worldview, so what was his understanding of what was socially or structurally the problem that needed to be reformed, he has these triple evils or three catastrophes, as he calls them, and those catastrophes are poverty, racism, and militarism. And he says they're the three catastrophes that really need to be fought, not just on a local level, but on a global context. So he's anti-imperial in that sense. He was against the war in Vietnam. He was against the segregation of apartheid. And he said that when you allow these two triple evils or these three catastrophes to manifest, you have what's called spiritual blackout. And he said that a nation that continues year after year to spend more monetary on military defence than on programs of social uplift is opposing spiritual death. And I think that really constitutes most Western nations at the moment. Certainly Australia, certainly the United States are prepared to spend more on their military defence than on programs of social uplift. But having been able to identify these three catastrophes, he is not an ideologue. So he does read all of the literature on communism. He does read all the libertarians and the founders of capitalist thought. And he says that they are both left wanting. So ideology is dangerous, which is, interesting coming from a revolutionary Christian. So he allowed for his spiritual, his teachings are driven essentially from a purpose that is incarnated in him by a sense of the divine. But in terms of ideology, he doesn't accept capitalism as complete, and he doesn't accept communism as complete. So he says of both of those, truth is found neither in traditional capitalism nor in classical communism. Each represents a partial truth. Capitalism fails to see the truth in collectivism. Communism fails to see the truth in individualism. Capitalism fails to realise that life is social. Communism fails to realise that life is personal. The good and just society is neither the thesis of capitalism nor the antithesis of communism, but a socially conscious democracy which reconciles the truths of individualism and collectivism. And if we think about this in the contemporary context, we really haven't moved very far from that debate. So how to reconcile the truth of individualism and collectivism in the social contract is really the basis of, the debates around universal healthcare, the debates around restraints on the free market, the debates around individual responsibility in the social context are as relevant as they've ever been. But having, kind of identified his three catastrophes and having not been persuaded by any of the ideologies of his time and being infused with this, religious incentive, he sides clearly with solidarity with the poor, the disenfranchised, the marginalised, the oppressed. He sees siding with those communities as morally important. He sees economic restructuring as the most practical way that you can bring the possibility of peace and justice to people. He says the dispossessed of this nation, the poor, both white and Negro, live in a cruelly unjust society. They must organise a revolution against that injustice, not against the lives of the persons who are their fellow citizens, but against the structures through which the society is refusing to take means which have been called for and which are at hand to lift the load of poverty. And I think this is probably his most poignant message for contemporary times, because he really understands that the instruments of militarism, racism and poverty are factors of economic injustice. And it wasn't until he was organising a strike in Memphis that he was assassinated. So really the most divisive thing he did was try to mobilise the poor. And still you can see that these age-old questions of how to distribute resources are the most divisive and potentially the most dangerous. But I think what I found personally uplifting about reading King, and I am so cynical at this stage, is that he took non-violence to be his lawful wedded wife. He worked on the art of forgiveness, and he projected all of human civilization into a place of emancipation and saw that it was possible. Should we be able to work out a way to make prosperity something that it was least accessible to all peoples, and that it was the divine right of all peoples to have a sense of dignity, integrity and decency about their lives, and that absent the appropriate economic conditions that was not going to be possible. So the last quote that I thought particularly moved me, and I underlined it 4 or 5 times, is that he says, "And I say to you that I have decided to stick with love, for I know that love is ultimately the only answer to mankind's problems, and I'm going to talk about it wherever I go." And in a time that is so divisive, where the left seems unable to tolerate the left, the right seems unable to tolerate the right, and the capacity for them to tolerate each other, even in a domestic setting, never mind a world torn apart by war and division. That message kind of pierces through the abyss. Just the absence of that message anywhere, and the strength of that ideal, that there was a possibility to even articulate that love is ultimately the only answer to mankind's problems, and I'm going to talk about it wherever I go. It's just reassuring on a very profound level. So, Dr. King is often touted as the greatest, but I think because he truly is the greatest revolutionary Christian. Anyway, I will attempt to keep going with, I don't know what I did with the book, Hannah Arendt, The Origins of Totalitarianism. It is thick and heavy. We will plough on to the last video. Okay, thank you so much. Bye.